The HLOOKUP and VLOOKUP functions, while intended to be simplified lookup functions, can also be some of the most challenging functions for a newer Excel user to grasp. The HLOOKUP function stands for horizontal lookup, while the VLOOKUP function stands for vertical lookup. Their names, however, tend to create part of the problem in initially understanding them, depending upon how you interpret the horizontal and vertical lookup schemes. To learn about these functions, I'll continue to use the animals and zoo example that I introduced in the last lesson. Let's begin with the VLOOKUP function. The VLOOKUP function searches a vertical array for the lookup value. In our example, the animal names are arranged vertically, and so we want to search on them. I'll begin by going back to our summary and setting our search for the animal name by typing equals VLOOKUP D2 into my formula bar. So far, we've put the value that we want to search for into our function, but now we need to figure out the tricky part. Our table array needs to be formatted fairly specifically for our VLOOKUP function to work. So back on our data example tab, I need to define the table array such that the leftmost column of the range will be where the function searches. By selecting the range here for A5 to A22, I have a range appropriate for the lookup function. In this table, the VLOOKUP function will attempt to find the lion's value in the leftmost column of the range. If I were to change my table array to point to B5 to A22, since the B column does not contain animal names, it would not work. Additionally, if my animal names were in column B and I selected range A through AA, it wouldn't work in that case either. After I've selected my table array as A5 to A22, I need to determine my column index number. The column index number indicates which column, starting from the left, contains the value that I want to pull. For now, I'll enter the value 1, and we'll come back to this shortly. The final value I'm going to enter into this function is false. If you look at the tooltip help, you can see that true generates an approximate match, while false generates an exact match. An approximate match will return the closest value below the indicated value, and will only work if the values are ordered in ascending order. I'll cover this in more detail later. When I complete this function, I get the value lions, which seems odd, since that is my lookup value. This is because of my selection of 1 for the column index number, so let's learn about that in a little bit more detail. Let's go look at our data example to understand this better. If we assigned a number to each column of our table array from left to right starting at 1, column A would be 1, column B would be 2, column C would be 3, and so on. Each of these values represents the column index number as the VLOOKUP function sees it. As you can see for Zoo 1, there are 6 lions. So if I go and change my VLOOKUP column index to 2, I now get the value of 6. Now if I change my drop-down animal from lions to monkeys, thanks to my formula, the number will automatically update to the value of 2. I've described what the lookup function needs and how it works in concept, so let's break it down one final time before we move to the HLOOKUP function. On a piece of paper, let's say that I know that I need to find the value that is 5 spaces to the right of the word monkeys. Effectively, this is how the VLOOKUP function thinks. On my data example, I would start at the top and I would look at each animal name and find the row with monkeys. At this point, I will count 5 cells to the right, including the cell with monkeys as my first cell, and write this value down. So monkeys is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This value, as can be seen in my table, is 7. The HLOOKUP function works identically to this, except instead of searching along the leftmost column and counting out column indexes, it searches along the topmost row and counts out the rows down. So let's create an example with it. Our VLOOKUP looks for the animal name along the left, and since the HLOOKUP searches along the top row, it will be looking for the zoo number. I can start my HLOOKUP function the same way, where I'll write equals HLOOKUP D3 instead of D2, since again I'm looking at the zoo along the top row. Instead of the range A5 to A22 on the data example, I'll select the range B4 to A22, since we want the zoo name instead of the animal name. Just as the VLOOKUP function searches along the first column on the left, the HLOOKUP function searches along the top row. And as in our VLOOKUP function, where the column index told the function how many columns to move to the right to get the value, our HLOOKUP function has a row index. This row index will tell the function how many rows down to move in order to get our value. The monkey is the 5th row down, when including the name row, so putting a 5 here and false will get us the same value as we got with our VLOOKUP. To conclude this lesson, let's look at what the true and false values at the end of each function does. On this sheet, I have two subsets that contain the exact same data. One of them is sorted in ascending order, while the other is unsorted and random. Whenever you use the false lookup type in a VLOOKUP or HLOOKUP function, you are requiring that the value be exactly found to the decimal in order for the value to be appropriately identified. Look at row 6 in each of these tables. We have the value of 33.33%. If I do a VLOOKUP on either table, I have to have the exact right value within my search in order to get the appropriate match. But what if I just want the closest value that my table has to my lookup value? For example, suppose I wanted to look up when my project is first listed as being 50% complete. 50% never shows up in either of my tables, so false will not work and my function will return a £NA value. Now if I modify my false to be true, I get a result, but it's not exactly what I would have thought. In the unordered table, I've gotten 1/1/2010, which corresponds to the 0% entry. Obviously, my lookup does not work here. However, if I apply this to my ordered table, I get the date of 3/11/2010, which corresponds to the date of 49.5% completion. The true search will search the list for the value closest to, but less than the inputted value. This will only work if your data is in the correct type of order. If you look back at our unordered list, the 0% entry comes immediately before the 66.2% entry. The true lookup is going entry by entry in order, and when it finds the 66.2% and determines that it is greater than 50%, it moves back up one row to select that as the lookup value. The vast majority of the time you will likely want an exact match. That means that you'll need to always input the false value for those types of searches. While this input is optional, if you do not include true or false, then the function will assume that you want true. So if I take this lookup where I have the incorrect value, and if I repeat it and remove true, I get the same result since it assumes that true is the appropriate parameter. While not a full exercise, this workbook will be made available to you to review. You can see that I have a pair of 33.33% lookup values in rows 14 and 15. If you look at the cells individually, you'll see that they are different rounding versions of the same number. Try writing a VLOOKUP function on both tables with different combinations of true and false inputs to see how your results will differ. You'll discover that the lookup is quite persnickety when searching for values under the false setting, while the true setting follows a very strict protocol as well. These two functions can be useful in many different situations with time and practice. For now, look for or construct a few other data lists and experiment with the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions to get accustomed to how they work. I'll be using these as a springboard to jump into more advanced and thorough lookup approaches so that you can learn to get the most out of Excel.